Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing a solved cold case, but this one wasn't solved recently. The killer was convicted in 2001, however the case was reopened thanks to recent revelations that the medical examiner involved in this case had been using unreliable, misleading, and inaccurate methods of testing that may have compromised hundreds of cases in addition to this one. Let's get into it. It was around 4 p.m. on February 24, 1992, when Charlie Jensen returned to the remote home in Big Lake, Minnesota that he shared with his wife and children. When he got to the house, he found his young children alone and upset. He called out for his wife, Linda, but no one answered. The children were confused but fine. 9-year-old Joey was at the kitchen table, having just returned home from school and was doing homework. However, Charlie noticed that their 8-month-old daughter was in a playpen, wearing the same clothing that she'd slept in. He noted this as particularly odd, meaning the baby had been in the same clothes all day, which wasn't normal. He searched the home and noticed their bedroom door was closed, which he thought was odd. He opened the door and discovered his wife on the floor. She was naked, but covered with their comforter, which was soaked with blood. She'd been stabbed multiple times, with the knife still embedded in her chest, through the comforter, pinning it to her body. Charlie called 911. On the call, he was distraught and frantic. Linda Jensen was described as a beautiful, free spirit. As a child, she loved to go fast. She rode horses, ran track, and more than anything, she loved speed skating. She was passionate and loved life. She had an ideal childhood growing up in Minneapolis with her 3 siblings. When she was 18, she married her childhood sweetheart and the love of her life, Charlie Jensen. The two had been friends since they were kids, when every summer, Linda's parents rented a cabin from Charlie's family. As they got older, childhood crushes blossomed into teenage romance, and then the two got married after high school. At first, everything seemed to be perfect for the young couple. They were very much in love and welcomed their first child, Andrew, 3 years into their marriage in 1973. However, things didn't remain happy for the couple when Charlie began having substance abuse issues. His alcoholism drove a wedge into their marriage, and Linda couldn't find a way to make the marriage work. She would file for divorce 7 years into their marriage. A few years after her divorce, she met Robert Beard, and the two were married and had a child together, Joey. However, this marriage would be short-lived. Linda said that Robert had been abusive, and she quickly took herself and Joey far away from him. Linda married a 3rd time, this time to John Silliman, in 1986, and the couple moved to California. Joey was only a couple years old, and Silliman formally adopted him when he and Linda got married. Robert Beard relinquished his parental rights in exchange for forfeiting child support for the toddler. For a 3rd time, Linda found herself in a toxic marriage with a man who had changed after they'd tied the knot. After 2 years of marriage to John, she filed for divorce and moved back to Minnesota to be closer to her parents and siblings. Also nearby was her first husband, Charlie Jensen, and the two rekindled their romance. Charlie was now sober and had turned his life around, reminding Linda of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. In 1990, the two revealed to their family that they wanted to get remarried, which is what they did on April 4th, 1991, on what would have been their 20th wedding anniversary. The two gave birth to their 2nd child together, Lisa, months later. Law enforcement began an investigation of the crime scene, and each detective there noted that it had been an extremely violent and overkill of the victim. The medical examiner noted the time of death had been hours prior to Charlie coming home, putting the time of death sometime between 8 and 10 a.m. that morning. Charlie was questioned, as well as underwent a polygraph test, which he passed and was quickly cleared as a suspect. He said that that morning had seemed very normal, but he had tried to call Linda around 9:45 a.m. and was concerned when no one answered. He called again around noon and a 3rd time in the mid-afternoon. After the 3rd call, he left work early. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation, and the stab wounds may have been caused post-mortem. The knife used in the attack had been a steak knife taken from the kitchen block on the counter. There had been no sign of forced entry, and law enforcement believed that after Charlie left for work, someone had come to the door, forced their way inside when Linda opened it. There had been no sign of anything stolen or that the home had been searched, so the motive was determined to be exclusively to attack Linda. Detectives weren't able to pull any fingerprints or blood evidence related to the killer. Only bodily fluids were recovered from Linda's body, which were collected and stored. The only thing in the home missing was the bed sheets from Linda and Charlie's bed. Big Lake was a quiet community, and the Jensen home was quite remote, so there were no neighbors nearby that would have heard anything. However, an unexpected witness was at the right place at the right time. A local mail carrier was doing the rural route, and while delivering the mail to the Jensen home the morning of the murder, she saw a man leaving the driveway in an older two-tone tan pickup truck. She said that she'd been there around 11:30 a.m., which fell within the TOD of Linda. At the time, she couldn't explain it, but she paused for a moment and examined the driver, and later was able to give the police sketch artist a detailed description of the man. She described him as a Caucasian man with a scruffy beard. She said that he looked like he was in his late 30s to early 40s. Charlie had left for work around 7 a.m. that morning. He arrived on time and was seen by coworkers, who also confirmed he hadn't left until later that afternoon. Joey left for the bus around 8:30 a.m. No one in the area recognized the sketch, but several people reported seeing the pickup truck around town that morning, but no one knew who it belonged to. Detectives brought the sketch around the area, and it was widely publicized, but no one could identify the man. Eventually, this led detectives to believe the killer was someone from outside of the community and began to look into Linda's other marriages. Detectives discovered that both of Linda's ex-husbands weren't happy with her. Robert Beard had been quite aggressive lately, demanding shared custody of their son, Joey. Joey barely knew his father, Robert, having only met him a handful of times in his life. The father figure he really knew was his adopted father, John Silliman. Detectives learned that Silliman also abused substances, particularly alcohol and drugs, and Linda had been desperate to leave the marriage for a long time and finally did when, during an argument, he hit Linda. During the marriage, Silliman had been insistent that Linda have a child with him, and she'd been adamant that she didn't want any more children. As a compromise, he adopted Joey, but when Linda left him, she got pregnant with Charlie, which enraged him when he learned that Linda went on to have more children. In addition to that, Linda petitioned to receive child support from Silliman for Joey, which he was refusing to pay for. Both Beard and Silliman were interviewed as suspects, as both men had significant motives. When Beard was interviewed, he lied about repeatedly calling Linda in the days before her murder. He also denied threatening her. He then revealed he didn't have a vehicle and therefore couldn't have murdered his ex-wife. Detectives then flew out to California to interview Silliman, but he was quickly cleared by alibi. He had been teaching at the time of the murder. However, still suspicious, they entertained the idea that he might have hired someone to kill Linda, and his bank records were subpoenaed, but there was nothing in the bank records that showed any evidence of a murder for hire. Both men were asked to submit a DNA sample, and both men did. Only months after Linda's murder, her case went cold. Linda's sister, Sandra, spearheaded a continued campaign to keep Linda's murder case alive. She called the sheriff's office weekly. She went on every television show she could. She made good on a promise she'd made to her little sister to never give up. In 1999, a new sheriff took over, and because of Sandra's persistence, he reopened the investigation. In the last decade, DNA evidence had significantly advanced, so they retried the DNA sample alongside the suspects in the case, which included all of Linda's ex-husbands as well as known criminals in the area. In total, 80 DNA samples had been collected in 1992, but had never been tested, and none of them ended up matching. In 2000, detectives received the first viable tip in nearly a decade. A woman named Angela Hannon had information that had been nagging at her for years. On the call, she explained that in 1992, she'd been having an affair with Kent Jones. She said that once she had brought up Linda's murder in conversation randomly. It had come to her mind because the Jensen home was right next to the Joneses, and she thought she might have asked him if he had known the family. Shockingly, Jones had become livid with her and vehemently denied that he knew Linda. The reaction had been so strong and so aggressive that it had always stuck in her mind, and then months later he brought it up, and he said he did know Linda, and in fact knew her quite well. He also noted that he used to watch her every morning jog past his house. The two incidents had never sat right with Angela. Both times Linda Jensen had come up in conversation, Jones had perplexing reactions. It left Angela to think Kent Jones knew more than he was letting on. Law enforcement looked into Kent Jones, and they too wanted to know what he knew about Linda Jensen. Detectives learned that Jones was a local Boy Scout leader. He was also a family man with 4 children and had been married to his wife for years. They also discovered that Jones had been one of the first people interviewed in the neighborhood. When reviewing the notes from the interview, they noticed that Kent's wife, Deborah, said that he'd been at home all day, and because she alibied him, he wasn't noted as a suspect. They also noted that Deborah had once gone to the ER with a stab wound. Notes from the visit stated that she'd slipped near the dishwasher and had fallen on a knife that had been loaded, handled down. Court records also showed that Kent Jones had multiple domestic violence calls to his home, but his wife never pressed charges, and he got away with it every time. Kent was also convicted of insurance fraud when a storage unit he owned had a fire. He claimed to have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of items, but it was later determined that the value of the items were closer to $1,000. He served jail time for that conviction. Detectives went to Jones's home to ask about February 24th, 1992. He told law enforcement he didn't know Linda and they'd never spoken. But that was when Deborah chimed in, reminding Kent that Linda had come over days before she was murdered. She had talked to Kent about enrolling Joey in his Boy Scouts troop. At that, he became visibly annoyed with his wife. After that, he changed his story. He said that he saw her jog past the house every day and that he knew her as an acquaintance. Law enforcement then asked casually if he wouldn't mind providing a DNA sample, just to eliminate him. Jones refused, becoming the first person in the case to require a court order for DNA. They got the court order that same day, went to collect it, and it matched the DNA found on Linda's body. Kent Jones was arrested on July 25, 2000 for first-degree murder. A grand jury added 2 additional counts of second-degree murder as well as criminal sexual conduct in the first degree. And then he went to trial the following spring. The arrest shocked the communities. Kent had been heavily involved in the community. He had also been involved in his church, and everyone thought he was a good person, a good husband, and a good father. No one ever suspected him as a murderer. No one knew about his dark side. The other women, the injuries on his wife, or the obsession turned murder of Linda Jensen. Jones maintained his innocence despite the DNA results, and during trial, when he took the stand, he made a shocking claim. He stated that he and Linda had been having a consensual, physical relationship, and the two had been together the day before the murder, which he believed would have explained why his DNA was found at the scene. This angered Linda's family, who felt that he had taken Linda's life, and now he was trying to take her reputation. The medical examiner disputed the claim by stating the condition of the sperm collected that day made it unlikely to have been over 24 hours old. After that, his lawyers tried to pin the blame on alternative killers, which included Robert Beard and a man from the fitness center Linda worked out at, but both were cleared with DNA evidence. Throughout the investigation and trial, Jones's story had changed and evolved multiple times. So often that once he made the claims about being in a relationship with Linda, it might have been one too many for the jurors, who ultimately convicted him on all 3 charges. He was sentenced to life in prison. And this should have been the end of the case. It had been a verdict that had set Linda's family free, and Sandra and Charlie had started to move on with their lives. But then, in 2004, Kent Jones filed for an appeal. He asked for a new trial on the grounds that the first judge hadn't allowed him to present evidence that pointed to an alternative suspect to the jurors. The motion was granted, and Jones was released while a second trial began. In 2006, the second trial started. This time, his lawyers were allowed to present evidence that opened up the possibility that 2 other men could have committed the murder, despite DNA evidence clearing them. He also revised the timeline. He said that he and Linda had been intimate together the morning she was killed, but he had left before she'd been murdered. He then also pointed the finger at Charlie himself, claiming that Charlie had discovered their affair and murdered Linda in a jealous rage. When he made this claim, those in the courtroom stated that Charlie was seething with rage, and they were certain that things were coming to a boiling point. One of Kent's defenses was that he was, and this is a quote here, a skilled lover, and Linda found him irresistible. Kent's lawyers then called his wife Deborah to the stand to corroborate that he was a skilled lover, and then she, on the stand, said that he wasn't skilled at all. He certainly hadn't been skilled in convincing the jury, because he was again convicted on all 3 charges and again sentenced to life in prison. A new medical examiner presented evidence for the prosecuting side, and this would become a huge issue later down the road. Dr. Michael McGee had been what was described as the premier medical examiner in the state and was often the first called to present evidence for trial. Working from 1985 to 2019, he was involved in 216 trial cases, which included multiple death penalty cases. With advances in DNA, many cases in Minnesota were getting appeals and retesting of evidence. In several cases, several convicted individuals had been found to be innocent after years in prison. A pattern began to emerge, and in many of these cases, Dr. McGee had been the medical examiner. In 2022, an independent audit revealed some shocking revelations about Dr. McGee and his office. For 35 years, Dr. McGee's office had been unchecked in a unique arrangement he had with the county. He'd been brought in as an independent contractor. His most recent contract had paid him almost $800,000 a year for his services. Since he was an independent contractor, not a public service employee, this meant that he wasn't subject to filing records, and left him in a position where he was his own boss and no one really examined or audited his work. It also meant that he wasn't subject to keeping his findings public records. This was highly unusual for the industry and really should never have been allowed to begin with. It was also determined that McGee often used unreliable or inaccurate tests and was in a position where he could doctor the evidence to whatever he needed. Many of his methods weren't industry standard and oftentimes were condemned by other medical professionals because they were so inaccurate. This is a medical professional hired and paid to present as accurate evidence as possible in order to make sure people have fair trials. At this time, it is unknown how many cases are being impacted, but several people are being awarded overturns and releases. One of those who are asking for release is Kent Jones, and whatever tests were run on the sample could ultimately have contaminated the evidence in Linda's case.
31 years ago this week, a murder mystery unfolded in one of the safest enclaves in Minnesota, Big Lake in Sherburne County. Linda Jensen's body was discovered by her husband in their bedroom. In another room, their toddler in a crib, undisturbed. Jensen's nude body was partially covered by a comforter, pinned to her chest with a knife. But it was a killing with few clues. The sheets of the bed were missing. No fingerprints, no sign of forced entry into the home. The case would hinge on the autopsy performed by Ramsey County Medical Examiner Dr. Michael McGee. Dr. McGee testified Jensen was stabbed and strangled while being raped, that she was killed between 8 and 10 o'clock that morning. His findings based on an acid phosphatase test, like the one seen here, used to determine the presence of semen. Based on the intensity of the purple color of that positive test, Dr. McGee came up with a time frame for the killing.
No, it's terrible. That's not something that should be done. Many laboratories have rules against doing that, but unfortunately, it's not as rare as it should be.
Kate Judson is with the Center for Integrity and Forensic Sciences, a kind of watchdog for junk science used by law enforcement and the courts. She says the acid phosphatase test reacts to an enzyme found in semen, but that same enzyme is also found in vaginal secretions and produced by a body's decomposition. Even 30 years ago, it was considered only a preliminary indicator for semen that didn't establish a reliable time frame and needed to be confirmed by other testing.
And then, of course, if you're able to do DNA testing and the mix, and it's not an overly complex mixture and it's sufficient to be tested, you can get a DNA profile.
There was a DNA match 8 years later that led to Jensen's neighbor and Boy Scout leader Kent Jones, who's currently serving a life sentence for Jensen's murder at Stillwater Prison. He's always maintained his innocence, but he's been found guilty in 2 separate trials. The Fox 9 investigators have learned the Minnesota Attorney General is currently reviewing his case. The problem is, over the years, Kent Jones would keep changing his story. At first saying he knew nothing about the killing, then admitting he had had an affair with Linda Jensen, but didn't remember when they had sex. Finally admitting they had had sex the morning that she was murdered. Dr. McGee's testimony and this acid phosphatase test would provide the time frame for the killing. Dr. McGee used the same test with Alfonso Rodriguez in the murder of Drew Shadeen. Dr. McGee testified during the death penalty phase that the acid phosphatase test showed Shadeen was raped 24 to 36 hours before she was killed and had stab marks around her neck and body. But experts said those marks were likely caused by scavenging animals, and elevated levels on the acid phosphatase test were likely caused by decomposition, because the samples didn't contain any sperm. Forensic experts testified they would never use or interpret the test in the way Dr. McGee did to establish a time frame. In a scathing rebuke last month, a federal judge said Dr. McGee's testimony was unreliable, misleading, and inaccurate. Rodriguez remains in prison. But based on the Rodriguez case, the Ramsey County attorney is now putting McGee's work under a microscope, conducting an independent review of more than 70 cases where McGee may have provided pivotal testimony.
It's my job not to protect conviction at all costs. It's my job actually to do the right thing, to do justice, and to figure out what the truth really is without fear or favor.
But what if Dr. McGee was only part of the problem?
Is there a concern about medical examiners giving the cops what they want?
Yes, that's a serious concern. That is something that is referred to as role effects bias. So when you see yourself as part of a particular team, then you want to help your team win, right?
And remember, medical examiners aren't just coming up with the cause of death, they're also determining the manner of death, accident, murder, or suicide, a critical starting point for any case. So if a medical examiner makes a mistake or over-interprets evidence, that conclusion may get adopted as gospel by homicide detectives. The prosecutor buys in and charges someone with a crime. A judge may allow unreliable evidence into a trial. And ultimately, it's a lone defense attorney who is left to challenge faulty, yet very scientific-sounding evidence that is often persuasive with a jury.
When we talk about these tragedies, they're in some ways like airline tragedies, in that it's not one thing that goes wrong. It's one thing that goes wrong that goes unchecked or not properly addressed by others.
Well, in a way, what you're telling me is even more unsettling, because what you're saying is it's not just the medical examiner who may have failed here. It's the prosecutor, it's the defense, it's the judge, it's the system.
It's the system, yeah. And I do think that experts have a higher obligation to make sure that what they say is scientifically accurate and that they don't overstate the science.
Role effects bias may be a particularly useful insight with Dr. McGee, who for 35 years was the go-to expert in Minnesota, even training police and prosecutors on the nuances of forensic science. McGee was also his own boss, an independent contractor for Ramsey County, which paid up to $787,000 a year for McGee and his team, plus insurance. McGee was also president of a company that performed autopsies around the state and upper Midwest. His perceived credibility among law enforcement may explain why so many red flags with his work were ignored. For more than a decade, the Fox 9 investigators and others have reported on issues with Dr. McGee's work, including the case of Thomas Rhodes, who said his wife died in a nighttime boating accident. But McGee testified she was beaten and run over several times with the boat.
Nothing like that happened. There was no contact between myself and my wife that night.
Last month, a judge vacated Rhodes' murder conviction, citing problems with Dr. McGee's testimony. Rhodes left prison after serving 25 years. Judges have also overturned or vacated murder convictions in 2 shaken baby cases, Michael Hansen in Douglas County and Robert Kaiser in Stearns, because Dr. McGee gave false or incorrect testimony.
And so that should be a red flag for folks, because we're not talking about everybody makes mistakes, but we're not talking about small ones. We're talking about an error that actually drove a prosecution.
Kent Jones may well be the next case under the microscope. And Jones has long maintained there was other DNA found in the knife Linda Jensen was killed with. 31 years later, the murder in Big Lake may become a mystery once more. Thanks in no small part to the medical examiner everyone believed and few questioned.
Unfortunately, Kent Jones could walk free or subject Linda's family to a 3rd trial. Only time will tell what happens next. At this time, Kent Jones' next opportunity for appeal is in 2030. Well, that's going to be it for this video. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end. As always, if you want to support the channel, the easiest way is to hit the like button. You can also subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss my next upload. Other ways to support the channel by joining my Patreon or channel membership. I also have merch, and you will find all the links in the description box, plus a few extras. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter for more. But with that being said, thank you so much for being here and supporting what I do. It is very appreciated. That's it for me. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye for now.